I think we'll make a start. Thank you for coming today. Lots of people interested in artificial intelligence in the public sector, which is great to see, or at least people wanting to support, which is great too. The presentation today is going to focus mainly on how public procurement under the current rules, so still the European rules, can or cannot avoid the phenomenon of digital translation being captured by commercial tech providers. That's the main talk. But before we get there, just to present the bigger project that this is a part of, that was generously or not so generously funded by the British Academy with a mid-career fellowship. It's a project I started in 2018, and I started thinking about how procurement is involved in this process of buying technology and the digitalization of procurement itself. And I saw that it has mainly two dimensions or two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, procurement is made to control a little bit how the public sector buys artificial intelligence. On the other hand, procurement is adopting artificial intelligence to manage the procurement process. So I divided the project in two parts. The first part is what I called gatekeeping. Basically, the straightforward intuition between this part of the project is that the public buyer can be a responsible buyer for artificial intelligence, and in developing best practice of how to buy artificial intelligence, it can become a sort of a norm setter or a beacon for best practices that then others, particularly in the private sector, can replicate. And what has been increasingly said, and we'll come back to that later, is, well, if you want AI to be trustworthy or if you want it to be ethical, just put in the contract, right? Require the tech provider to comply with whatever goal through the contract. So I looked at that basic claim through theories of regulation by contract, public governance, and other theories of organizational decision-making. One of my favorite ones, garbage can theory, and I can explain what that means later if anybody is interested. The second part, I'm not going to talk about it today, but it's just so you know, and there's some policy briefing at the back if anybody's interested, is the bit where procurement itself is being digitalized. So where we're using automation and data insights to try to change the way we buy, to pay invoices automatically and things like that. And in 2018, the basic claim is like, oh, just put procurement on a blockchain. It's going to be great. No corruption, it's self-executing. Now it's morphed a little bit. Now it's, oh, just use ChatGPT to evaluate the tenders that you receive. These are basically techno-solutionist approaches to trying to deploy the technology. So what I did is take a bit of a hard look at the technology, what is it can actually do with the functionalities, and also what does it need? So what enablers, what roadblocks are there that probably make it almost impossible to put it on a blockchain or use ChatGPT. So we're not going to talk much about this today, but if anyone is interested, happy to explore a bit in the Q&A. Now, as to the outputs, there's a chunk of stuff in my blog. If anyone is interested, you can go and see it. A recording of this will also be there, so it's a bit like a Russian doll of outputs that themselves reference each other. And there will be a book, hopefully, if I manage to write the conclusion and send it off, coming out next year. So any comments, most welcome. I can still change it. Now, as of the main course for today. So we all have a bit of an idea that the public sector is changing. I think we all experienced it firsthand during COVID in particular. All of a sudden, things that always required you to go to an office and deliver a paper, all of a sudden you could do from home, taking pictures of things. There were all these apps we were asked to use. So we know that the public sector is becoming more digital. But what does that exactly mean? Where are we? So the first thing I did is I asked an AI to imagine what does a public servant using AI look like. That's what I came up with. I don't know if you find it promising or not. I see a few things. It looks a bit gender biased. I don't know what those robots want to do with me. But I think this can maybe give us a bit of it looks a bit like a hopeful approach, right? But then I thought, let's not go to what the AI imagines itself doing, but let's see what the government imagines a digital public sector looks like. And what the UK government thinks is that it can transform the public sector for the digital future in just 3 years. So in 2022, it published a strategy called Transforming for a Digital Future that said that by 2025, we will have nothing else than a transformed, more efficient digital government that provides better outcomes for everyone. It's quite a tall order, especially to deliver it in 3 years. So they broke it down in 6 missions. And the first mission of those is to transform public services that achieve the right outcomes. Again, sounds quite ambitious, but then you look at the KPIs that are tucked away somewhere in the strategy, and then what actually means is that of the top 75 digital services, and these are things like renewing your driving license, submitting your self-assessment, or any other interaction you have with central government, of those 75 most used, 50, so 2/3, should reach what under their own benchmark is a great level of service. It doesn't look very transformative, pushing 2/3 of the services that are already in place and used a little bit up in your own benchmark. It's also not very ambitious if you bear in mind that in 2014, there was already a pilot to digitalize 25 services. So this doesn't look transformative or groundbreaking, but maybe because we have a different government owning what's happening now, if you follow the news, things are moving really fast right now. The current Prime Minister wants to be re-elected on the basis of being the no small boats and AI guy. I'm not going to talk about boats today, but he's throwing every pound to the issue. In only the last 3 months, they announced £100 million for foundation models, i.e. the British ChatGPT, £54 million in AI safety. We'll also hold the first global summit in AI safety in the fall. Now they have announced $21 million for the NHS to take diagnostic AI. They are also investing a massive amount of money in the creative industries, trying to create a hub for the production of films and series in the UK. And the Chancellor has basically told every department, so this is across the public sector, to accelerate the adoption of AI to boost economic growth. So we are in this thought that deploying AI is going to make the economy grow, it's going to take us out of all of the problems we have. So not only will we have better public services, but also we'll have a better economy. And it looks like Labour, nobody knows exactly what they're promising, but it doesn't sound too different. They also want to use the public sector buying AI to be a viable customer for startups. Basically, everybody thinks that the UK can use the digitalization of its public sector for digital industrial policy, so to create demand for startups to produce these things in the UK. So we will see this change. Now, what would it look like for us on an everyday basis? Let's look at an example. As part of the workforce strategy unveiled last week for the NHS, one of the bits that is, again, a little bit tucked away is that they're going to create a council to explore how digital technologies can be used to reduce the administrative burden of running the NHS. And one of the things they want to do is create these robot administrative assistants, basically for 2 things that have been identified. One, they want to use automation for appointment making. So basically, you're not going to have to call someone to get an appointment, but you're going to interact with a robot to make your appointments. And the other one is that they want to use things like ChatGPT to transcribe doctor's notes. I don't know if you've seen a doctor's notes, but I'm not sure that the AI can decipher it. But I will just concentrate on the first thing, right? So it looks like pretty straightforward. How difficult can it be to create a chatbot that when you need an appointment with your GP or with your consultant you've been referred to can support you in doing that? But it's actually quite difficult, and quite a few things can go wrong if you start thinking about it. On the left, there is the standard pathway to get an appointment for an endoscopy if you're suspected of colorectal cancer in the Devon Hospital. I don't think that's a pathway that leads itself to automation very straightforwardly, because there's quite a few ways in which you can get to the same place. The processes are not entirely straightforward, and I'm sure there's lots of discretion in every one of these spaces as to, do you need a referral now, do we wait a bit more? So these are not things a robot can easily do, right? You need something that is completely mapped out with very hard rules if you want to make it automated. The second thing is we know the NHS is not particularly a beacon of trust when it comes to managing patients' data, and we have had loads of cases in the last 6 or 7 years about the NHS disclosing too much data, giving data away they shouldn't have. So we have data governance issues, and we also know from the A-levels fiasco that whenever we try to automate something, we probably just multiply and exacerbate the inequalities and the unfairness already embedded in the system. So we have lots of problems already, technical, data governance, and broader social justice considerations. So a lot to think about, and we're going to try to do this at speed, which is never a good thing. What I worry about is all of this, plus the fact that I think there is a very big risk that this process is not going to be conducted by public interest considerations. I think, for the reasons I will give you later, the public sector is in a very weak position to drive the process of digitalization, so it will end up in the hands of the technical providers. It will end up in the hands of consultants, in the hands of companies saying, I know how to create this chatbot that can do the appointments. Don't worry, I'll do it. And what I think that means is that first, the public interest can be sidelined, and then commercial interests or other interests can be put first. But also, it creates significant risks of capture, right? What risks of capture? Risks that the impact assessments will not be done in a proper way, and that the harms and risks of the technology are going to be hidden, and that there are going to be claims of excessive capability of the technology, what Professor Kogan helped me label superficial intelligence, right? It's not new, by the way, we'll talk about that. But anyone can come and say the technology can do all of these things, and then if you don't interrogate that critically, you don't realize what are the potential downsides of that. So I think we can create this cycle of techno-solutionism. The second thing is we privatize regulatory power. Right now, we don't know how to regulate the technologies, but because the provider comes with a solution, the solution becomes the regulation. And I think that's very problematic in many areas of public sector activity. And then also it creates dependency. So the public sector is already in a weak position. It will become unable to manage processes or systems that it doesn't understand or it hasn't designed. It doesn't have the institutional memory because the consultants came and went and nobody knows why we did things in a specific way. So these are things that worry me. It cuts across all the other considerations. This has implications for how do we sort technical issues, how do we sort data governance issues, how do we sort fairness and justice and other considerations. So that's why I wanted to concentrate on that, and that's a bit the prism I take to my research. Now, why procurement? Well, because what we know is that these technologies are being bought, and the moment the public sector buys something, it needs to go through a procurement process. So whether we want it or not, procurement is in a position where it needs to do something about this, either just go and buy it or try to regulate it. And what's been happening increasingly in the UK is that because the government doesn't want to regulate, and it's been made very clear in the AI white paper of March, then there's calls for procurement to come and fill in the gap. For example, in a live inquiry that the House of Commons is running on the governance of AI, there have been submissions by, for example, the Committee of Standards in Public Life saying that the public sector needs to use its financial muscles to force those private entities developing AI for the public sector to meet the standards in public life. And we have also heard from, for example, the Royal Academy of Engineering that if there are standards that starts being developed to try to regulate the technology, those standards need to be propagated through procurement. So procurement is seen as a tool of soft regulation or as the only tool to try to regulate what the public sector is doing. And this is very much baked into the current national AI strategy. This is, to the right, the national AI strategy from 2021. Lots of management speak implicit here, lots of pillars, lots of targets, lots of deliverables. But there are two crucial ones that are maybe difficult to read, but the government expects the public sector to be an exemplar of AI procurement and ethics. So they want the procurement function to develop approaches to ethical AI. And they also want AI to help generate greater value for money in the expenditure of public funds. So bearing in mind that there are about 18 goals, 2 of those goals relate to procurement. And what the government claimed in 2021 is that they had already taken steps, so the job was done, to train the public buyers and to basically empower them to confidently and responsibly go and buy AI for the benefit of citizens. Again, that's quite a claim, and it's a claim that, in my view, doesn't tally up with the current regulatory framework. If we look at the regulatory framework, you can comb through the procurement rules, and there's quite a few, and you will find that there's no specific rule about the acquisition of digital technologies or AI whatsoever. The only thing that exists is what's called a spend control, which means that for central government-funded bodies that want to buy an AI, about 18 months before they go and procure, they have to submit a business case. And the business case is looked at, and there are some policy considerations, but most of them are about, are we going to burn this money, or is it likely that this is going to work? So it's very much a budget management approval tool. There are no ethical considerations taken into account. There are no technical considerations taken into account. And it's also 18 months from procurement, so it's quite an early on look. But other than that, the public buyers are left to go and figure it out by themselves. There will be no rules created by the current government, so all they can rely on is 2 2019 documents, one guidance on the use of AI in the public sector, which was produced by the Alan Turing Institute, and one set of guidelines on procuring AI that was developed by the UK as a pilot in the World Economic Forum. If you look at the guidelines, they say things that are very intuitive. For example, are you sure that your data is not biased? But they don't say how to test that. They don't say how to implement it. So they are not really operationable. And every public buyer is left to figure it out by themselves every time they go to buy. So it's not really, in my view, sufficient to empower them to confidently and responsibly go and buy AI. And I think that this creates a problem that fundamentally we're letting it completely to self-regulation by the public sector, which is also very strange. Usually the public sector has quite a lot of constraints on how they have to do things. Now they are told, just go and buy it. And that's a bit strange. My claim is that this is just not going to work. And this regulatory approach will not work because of the reasons I will present later, but fundamentally because it's a non-approach, right? We haven't really been offered much to deal with AI different from, say, when we buy a photocopier, and that's significantly different. So the first thing that prompts me to think this approach will not work is that we have a very close cousin in the adoption of AI by the public sector that I think serves as a cautionary tale. It's not new that the use of algorithms can be discriminatory, it can have biases. So the government itself launched an inquiry into it, and there was a report by the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation in 2020 that looked at how the public sector was adopting algorithms and found loads of problems, and issued very broad recommendations on how to tighten the regulation of this process of digital adoption in the public sector. One of the recommendations was that it should be mandatory for the public sector to disclose that they are using an algorithm for a specific task, right? So if I apply for a permit to change my windows and that is subjected to algorithmic decision making, they should tell me. So that then when the decision comes out, I know that in the context of challenging or not challenging. Very straightforward transparency requirement. What the government did is that it tasked the Office for AI with developing a standard. It's been developed. It's the first national algorithmic transparency standard, but made it voluntary. Right? The recommendation was not develop a standard. The recommendation was make it mandatory to disclose. They sidestepped the recommendation and said, there is a standard, but you can use it if you want. The standard has been used so far by 6 institutions, 6 of which were in the pilot to develop the standard. So it's been used by no one voluntarily outside of the pilot. Also, as of 4th of July, we have information dating back to January 2023. So this is not even being updated. It's pretty much relatively useless. You could say, well, maybe nobody's using AI. Maybe nobody's using algorithms. That's why there are no disclosures. But we know from work of legal charities, such as the Public Law Project, that there are many instances of adoption of algorithms. They have created, on the basis of freedom of information requests, a register. It's very patchy, but at the time when there were 6 in the official disclosure, they already had 42. So we know that there is a lot of algorithmic adoption that is not being disclosed. Why is it not being disclosed? Because it's voluntary to disclose. And if you're in the public sector and you're doing something that will trigger contestation, that will trigger a problem, you just don't tell, and then there's no problems. So voluntary rules for the public sector, not necessarily going to work. We don't have the right incentives. But even setting that aside, I think we have 3+2 challenges. I don't say 5, not because I want to obscure things, but because I think there are 3 challenges that are general about trying to do something about AI regulation and digitalization more generally, and there are 2 that are specific about procurement. The challenges are around data governance, about digital skills, about the fuzziness of the goals of what AI regulation should look like, and then specifically in procurement, we have a problem of where the procurement function is institutionally embedded, whether it's sufficiently detached or not from the object of regulation, and also about the tools that it has. So how can the procurement function translate these goals into specific requirements? All of this creates problems, and I'll just go quickly through them. Data. There's a lot of data in the public sector, but the data is usually in the wrong format, in the wrong place, siloed. It's very hard to exploit for the deployment of AI. What nobody will gain lots of political capital for doing is to say, we need to invest a lot of money in the next 5 to 7 years to just put the data in good shape. So then we can think about AI deployment, right? All the promises are about, we are deploying AI tomorrow, we're putting all this money into deploying AI. But if you don't have the right data, the AI is just not going to work, because these are all data-intensive technologies. And this is one first problem. that we don't have the data ready, so we cannot hit the ground running. We need to first create the data infrastructure. This is boring, this is difficult, this is expensive. So that's a challenge. It's also a challenge when some of that data is personal data, because the regulatory framework for personal data protection is not quite there yet. We have lots of contestation, for example, about do you have a right to an explanation or not? How big must it be? And the UK government is actually going backwards. In the reform to the data protection rules in the UK, we want to reduce the guarantees for individuals, which means we are creating more data governance risks. We're also creating potentially more distrust in what the public sector is going to do if we don't feel our data is safe. So we have problems there. And the final one is about the speed at which these things can happen. In procurement, there's been, for the last about 8 years, a project to try to have procurement data out in the open so we can do analysis. I think the PPE saga already says it all. It's very difficult to extract transparency about procurement from anybody. And even under the procurement bill, they calculate it's going to take at least 3 years more to start publishing data in a way that would allow for the deployment of AI. So we talk about 11 to 12 years in a very narrow set of public sector activity where there's also no personal data. It's all about commercial data. So it should be straightforward, but it takes a long time. So data will keep hindering the process for a while. The second thing that is important, and I think this is a scandal, so we are short of nurses and doctors, we know that, but we're even shorter of data scientists and we just don't know about it. But the National Audit Office issued a report, I think it's in March or April this year, where they said the government has committed to spend 8 billion in this strategy of digitalization by 2025, but at the same time, there are 4,000 data and data science vacancies open in the civil service. So this is only at central level. The gap is growing. So only 6 months of 2022, the vacancies grew by 7%. In 37% of the recruitment processes, they couldn't appoint anyone. So the public sector is just not attracting the data with the digital skills that we need to support this process. So it's not only that they are disadvantaged to the private industry, they keep falling further and further behind. And at the same time, they try to plug this gap by hiring lots of consultants. So loads of the money that could go into building that in-house capacity is being burnt on consultants. And for example, I made this claim in Denmark. I said, and probably it's more expensive to pay a consultant than it is to pay a core member of staff with the same skills. And somebody said, yeah, I get paid 6 times more than I was in the civil service in Denmark. But I think that's an indicator that we are overpaying for skills because we use them on an ad hoc basis rather than building the capacity in-house. Also, when we engage consultants, other than the problem of the consultant comes with their own agenda, who knows what they want to promote, probably they want to sell you the project or the service or the next thing. There's also the problem of loss of institutional memory, lots of consistency in decision-making, and also just lack of oversight. If I hire a data scientist, I cannot control them because I don't have the skills. And that happens in most of the public sector. So we don't know whether we're getting quality for what we're hiring. The third problem, and we start getting a bit more legal here, is about the fuzziness of sort of the goals. So when we talk about the public sector needs to use trustworthy AI or ethical AI or safe AI or fair AI or robust AI, what do we exactly mean? Because these mean different things to different people. For example, take fairness. To a statistician, fairness may mean something completely different than to a lawyer or to a philosopher. So the statistician is the one coding it, right? So we can have problems of understanding of what these things mean. We also have the problem of trade-offs between these things. For example, explainable and accurate AI. The more complicated the AI, the black box AI, tends to be better at their job. But it's impossible to know how it works. So in the public sector, it's problematic when you have a duty to provide reasons for your decisions. You cannot use AI you cannot understand. But that means you need to use AI that doesn't allow you the performance that more complicated AI would allow you. And this is a difficult political decision, really, that we have to make. We cannot leave it to the technicians to decide they want the better performing one or they want whatever they want. So these are contested concepts. And because they are contested, there's no metrics or methodologies on how to assess them. If you look at how an algorithm works, you don't have a rule to say, is this fair or unfair? Is this transparent or not transparent? It's all a matter of the context. And this makes it very problematic, especially for procurement, because in procurement, if you cannot set a specific value or a specific methodology to assess something, you're just not in a good position to do it. This is for example, I think it's easy to understand in relation to quality. there's been lots of outsourcing, and one of the requirements when a hospital outsources nursing services is that the nurses need to be compassionate. How do you measure compassion? How do you assess it? So you end up making sometimes the wrong decisions because the one that is better at glossing it over in their tender ends up getting the contract. That doesn't mean you get the most compassionate nurses, or maybe you get very compassionate nurses that are very expensive. So we're going to have the same problem with this because some of these concepts are still at the level of compassion in terms of our understanding and how we operationalize them. And now to the procurement bit I know everybody was waiting for. The problem with procurement as well is that we think about the public buyer, right? So we think it's like, oh, the state buys, as if it was a one thing, but the state is very atomized in the way it buys, and most of the public buyers can actually be quite weak buyers. They don't have a lot of financial muscle because they are a city council trying to buy an AI to deal with parking tickets, right? They're not going to have lots of skills. They will not be able to impose conditions on the tech providers because they are small. Maybe, if the Ministry of Defense buys an AI for the drones, they will hopefully know what they're doing. But there's a lot of variation, so we cannot talk about the public buyer as a one thing. The other problem is that the public buyer is also not usually separated, but it's a unit within the public organization that wants to use the technology. So for example, if the Bristol Trust goes and says, buy me those robot receptionists, I want them deployed by January so I can start doing these automated appointments, the procurement person has a difficulty in going, well, yes, board, but I'm sorry, it's not sufficiently explainable, or the data is not ready, we cannot do it. There's lots of political pressure, there's lots of organizational pressure for things to just happen. Procurement is not necessarily in a strong position to say you cannot do it or you cannot do it this way. And you would think that if you want to regulate the process, you need to have that position of saying this is not happening. The final one is that procurement usually gets into the picture and out of the picture if you look at the full cycle of the acquisition of an AI. Usually procurement is not at the stage of designing or deciding that an AI needs to be bought, and once the contract is in place, procurement disappears. Then it becomes an operational issue. So even if procurement wanted to put lots of constraints into the contract, procurement is not in charge of implementing the contract. And here, this creates a specific problem, because when we're talking in the past, for example, about using procurement for a specific policy outcome, in the UK, it's been used to ensure a fair wage. For example, a public buyer could say, you need to pay your employees a specific minimum wagely hour. And it's a requirement of the contract, and I can check if you do it or not. You don't want to do it, but I can check if you want to do it or not. Here, the problem is that the public buyer has an interest in regulating the AI, but the part of the organization that wants to use the AI may have an interest in deviating from the contract, because the public buyer can say, you need to implement this solution in a way that is fully explainable. That's a contractual requirement. Okay, procurement goes away, and then the operational part of the entity and the tech provider sit down and say, hey, if this was not fully explainable, it would be so much better. Let's just not make it fully explainable. Let's just go for higher performance. And that's it. They deviate away from the contract because they can have an incentive to both deviate from the contract, which is not usually the case when we talk about other uses of procurement for regulatory purposes. So procurement is not in a good place. And the last thing is that procurement doesn't have very good tools. Why? Because if we think about the basics, what we're trying to do with procurement is create a market competition situation for the contract. What we do is we advertise, entity A needs this thing, and basically we want everyone to tender for this thing, and we cannot be very prescriptive. If I go out to the market saying, I want to buy a Skoda Octavia that is white, please, then I only get competition between the dealers of a Skoda Octavia. But if I say, I want a car with these sorts of characteristics, then I can have more competition for it. And even better, if I say, I just want a mobility solution, then I can have even more competition for it. So procurement avoids technical prescriptiveness to the point that it's always mandatory to accept equivalence. Right? So you could say, I want a Dell computer or equivalent, because you cannot predetermine the outcome of the tender. When it comes to imposing regulatory requirements, it's very problematic, because I could say, I want an AI that makes appointments that is fully explainable, and by fully explainable, I mean this type of algorithm, but then I need to say, or equivalent. And then that makes things very complicated, because I will be just bogged down into assessing equivalence of different solutions. And because I don't have the capacity, I will probably just go like, yep, I take it, it's equivalent, and I end up buying something that's not what I want. There are also a few more problems. Procurement cannot invent the wheel every time. And at the same time, there are standard setting organizations that are already working on putting out standards saying, what does it mean that something is safe? What does it mean that something is trustworthy? So what they will do is, instead of saying safe for me means all of these things, they will say safe means International Standards Organization safety standard or equivalent, right? But by referring to the standard setting organization, this is not a way in which regulatory power gets transferred. It's not the public entity determining what it is safe, it's taking the definition from the entity. And the final thing is that in procurement, the remedies are contractual. So if the tech provider gave you a discriminatory algorithm, all you can do is sue them for damages under the contract, which is not going to be great when you have created mass damage because you deployed it and you affected everybody that was claiming for universal credit. So the regulatory tools in terms of enforcement are also not great. So all in all, this is not going to cut any ice. I'm not going to bore you with the recapitulation. I think you're there. So surprise, surprise, I think an alternative approach is necessary. I've said two main things are problematic. One, procurement is not in a situation of independence. It can be captured by the entities that want to use the technology or by the tech sector. And the second thing is procurement is not in a good place to create the mandatory requirements that should be complied with on a substantive basis. So very creatively, I say we need to create independence in the oversight, and of course we'll get to the mandatory requirements. I think we need a new authority. I call it the AI in the Public Sector Authority. I should have asked for marketing advice, but this is just a notional authority. It can be a unit within an authority, it can be a network of authorities, we can discuss that. But I think we need to create independence based on technical capability and political independence. What we want is an entity that looks at the technologies for what they are, and that they can drive the assessment of what social impacts are going to follow from the process of transition. And also, it should be an entity that raises the profile of being a data scientist in the public sector. You're not the guy in the corner that people come with problems. This is a big part of the profession, and so it should be created as a center of excellence. It should be given a budget and a strategy to try to create viable strategies of upskilling. And then, of course, we need mandatory requirements. So I think that the authority should certify the standards that come from industry. They should take a hard look at them from a public interest perspective, say, is this a standard I can endorse or not? If I cannot endorse it, then I develop my own standard. If I can endorse it, great. But only those that are certified or developed by the authority can be used in procurement. And of course, like anybody with a child, you know that the requirement is you need to wash your hands, but have you washed your hands? So they should also be involved in checking that this is actually happening. So even if there's going to be an industry of private audit certification based on those standards, I think they should also be able to carry out random inspections and do it to make sure that the standards are being applied properly. And of course, there should be a way for them to apply fines if that is not the case. Final thing to say, this is urgent, right? While we sit here, there's lots of public buyers buying stuff, buying AI, buying algorithms that are going to be deployed while there are no rules. So very soon, we're going to be sitting on a stock of digital solutions that may or may not comply with the requirements that end up emerging. And then it's going to be very difficult to take them away. It will cost money, it will be problematic, so we will start discussing about, should we grandfather them? Yeah, the algorithm of the prisons officers is a little bit racist, but should we just grandfather it? No, we shouldn't. And not to get there, we need to reverse the rule. The rule now is there's no rules. So you want an AI, go and buy it. We need to reverse it, and I think we need to permission it. So if the public sector wants to go and buy an AI, they need permission. They need to go to the authority, they need to make the case, they need to present the impact assessment, and then the authority says yes or no. Obvious complaint, it's going to delay things. I don't think it's a bad thing. The other thing is it's going to allow for a multi-tier to quickly evolve. If every city council wants to buy the same type of AI to improve their spam filter, that can be exempted very quickly. And we can start creating different levels of engagement and different levels of intervention in the assessment. But anyway, final thought, because otherwise this will not be an academic presentation. If you look at all of this from a governance perspective, it's just all wine in new bottles. There's no governance challenge that is not well understood. We know that technology allows for hype, and that the only way of fighting the hype is with capacity and expertise. Public sector needs to be able to push back against the claims of what the technology can do. We also know that procurement is about regulatory fix. Procurement is about buying stuff. It's not about regulating markets. So institutional design matters, institutional capacity matters, and procurement is not good at anticipating. So it's not good at creating precaution. So nothing new here either. We also know that things can get worse when procurement is used as a tool of industrial policy. what the government is actually saying when they say we need to digitalize the public sector is we need to create the next unicorn. We need to create the next $1 billion company in the UK, and therefore let's do it with public money through procurement. That's going to skew all procurement decisions. That's going to make it worse. And we also know that when there are these processes of incremental change, at some point there's a tipping point, past which it's very hard to undo the effects. So I would claim that before we get to the tipping point, we need to intervene. Anyway, I don't want to leave you with a depressing message. So I asked the AI to imagine what does a bright and fair digital future painted in a comforting style means. And before Kandinsky sue them for plagiarism, I will just thank you for your attention and invite you to have a coffee and cake. Thank you for your time. So any questions or comments? Eleanor.
What was
The garbage. So the garbage can theory is a theory of management that was developed looking at management of universities that says that when you have an organization that doesn't have clear values but discovers the values through action, and when you have a method that is not a method but it's learning by doing, and when you have different people intervening in decisions at different times, what you have is a garbage can, which is every time a problem comes up, somebody goes to the garbage can of discarded ideas and pulls one out and presents it again. So we keep bringing the same bad ideas forward. But this has been taken to say there's always windows of opportunity for policy entrepreneurs. So because the institutions are weak in determining their policy-making processes, when there is a window of opportunity, a policy entrepreneur can go and sell their idea. And I think we are in a situation where there's a digital policy opportunity. Anyone that claims to say, I can fix something with tech, immediately has the ear, immediately has the budget. And I think that's problematic. But, yeah. Becky.
I don't know if that's part of your project or if you, this basically sort of next step. I was wondering what's happening around the world. I mean, other countries will have similar problems, and dare I say, what's the EU doing?
So yes, that's a good question. So in case it was not for the recording, so the question is, what are other jurisdictions doing? What is the EU doing? Well, the EU, as you may know, has been embroiled for the last 3 years in negotiating the EU AI Act. The EU AI Act has a few commonalities with the proposal to take a multi-risk tier intervention. But the problem with the EU AI Act is that it will develop in an annex which activities are considered high risk and therefore subjected to similarly to pre-approvals and requirements. And those high-risk categories are quite patchy. So for some, for some industries, it's clear. For example, it says anything that you do in employment is high risk, because we know that the algorithms that sift through CVs can discriminate in many different ways, so that's a high risk. But when it comes to the public sector, the proposal has only been to include access to benefits and the dispatch of ambulances. Those are the two only cases that are so far considered high risk. So I think it's going to take a long time for more cases to filter through to the annex, because they're basically taking an evidence approach. So unless something has been proven to be high risk, they don't deem it to be high risk. And I think that will create a similar slowness in reaction. In the US, they are not concerned at all. Actually, this claim about just regulated by contract is very forcefully pushed by American scholars. But they have a very big tradition of regulating through contract. And also their procurement is only federal. So they mainly talk about military stuff. Everything else is at state level. So that's a bit different. Yeah, lots of movement. Phil.
I've got the microphone as well. So thank you very much for a really interesting. I was thinking about, one of the lines of something that you're not covering is the private sector and the impact of developments in the private sector. So you said very much that the pace of change is very, very quick. Things are happening. Presumably things are happening even more quickly, perhaps, in relation to the use of AI in the private sector. And there are lots of instances where there would be a lot of competition between lots of the private providers and public providers. So is there anything or is there potential for the public sector to benefit from what's going on in the private sector? Or are there dangers there and lessons for the public sector to learn?
That's a very good question. I think that, so there's lots happening in the private sector. But some things in the private sector are happening in platforms. So what we're seeing is the evolution of platform regulation, right? So like today, the Court of Justice said Facebook can be fined for competition law for breaching data protection. We have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act that look at services provided to consumers and gatekeeping platforms. So there's an approach to regulate the agents rather than the specific technological deployments. And by regulating the agent, you have some assurances that some things may not happen. Whereas in the public sector, maybe the idea is we don't need to regulate it because the public sector will always have the public interest at heart, which I think is a big assumption. But on learning, I think it's actually a risk. So for example, looking at the second part of the project, so procurement digitalization, lots of companies are digitalizing their procurement, but they can digitalize the procurement with very few constraints. For example, they say, we only accept 5 providers, and then we have electronic auctions with these 5 providers we have chosen. The public sector cannot do that. So I think the risk there is that if you take something that has been developed in the private sector and put it in the public sector, where the regulatory constraints are very different, you will have lots of breaches of procurement rules, state aid rules, and other rules. So I think there's limited space for learning, and also because lots of the things are different. Say, recommender systems is another one. If you go on Amazon, Amazon recommends your product based on people that they deem to be similar buyers to you. If you're interested, you buy it. If you don't, you ignore it, right? But it would be problematic to develop an Amazon for the public sector that says, oh, you're the Bristol City Council. Birmingham City Council bought this, so you might be interested. That's problematic. So this sort of collective filtering is not going to work. It would also be a fettering of your discretion and so on. So I think it's mainly the regulatory layer that prevents much learning or much transposition of things, but there is a lot of pressure to try to adopt solutions from the private sector into the public sector. John?
Some of the old bottles that are lying around come from ordinary, decent information technology back from the old days. Ordinary databases, ordinary IT systems. One was the National Police Information Authority, and then there was the National Programme for IT in the NHS. They tended to get stuffed with technology experts of a time, so they got a bit stuck in those organisations. But they didn't have problem domain expertise, and they didn't really have implementation domain expertise. So they managed to fulfill an extraordinary role of galvanising both the contractor and the police forces, ambulance trust, whatever, in universal hatred for these things. Have you studied these bodies? Do you think there's a risk in your...
Yeah. I haven't looked at that in detail. So the question would be who needs to be in the regulator, right? And should be a purely technical regulator, or do we need domain expertise, implementation expertise, but then also collective input into that? So how do we engage the different groups that are going to be affected by the AI deployment into the regulatory process? I haven't gone very far in thinking about that, but I think the problem with loads of those decisions is usually techno-solutionism. Just you put a bunch of people very excited about technology in a room, and they, it creates group thinking. So I think the way to break that up is through diversity of expertise in the regulator and through transparency, so people can push back and fit into the processes. But I haven't fully designed what it would look like. But if I do, I'll look at those bodies for inspiration.
I have the mic.
Oh, sorry, Václav.
Thank you so much, Albert, for the great presentation. I have very simple, but I suppose quite difficult questions. So you mentioned old wines in new bottles. Is there something fundamentally new, some fundamental new challenge or lesson to be learned? And what I have in mind here is that when we talk about AI and when we talk about the new ways how machine learning works and how we do not need to encode specifications and features because we let the model to learn those features. So then it seems to me that it might raise some fundamentally new questions with regards to how the public entity specifies what they want or do not want to be procured. So maybe that then the organizational scheme within the public sector is not well suited to come up with these very high level specifications at the level of those individual entities. So that's just one idea of how I thought about these fundamentally new challenges. So is there something fundamentally new?
But I don't think that's fundamentally new. So it has always happened that the public buyer that tries to buy something innovative doesn't necessarily fully understand the technology it's trying to buy. Right? And machine learning now looks like something very difficult to understand, but to data scientists it's not that difficult to understand, it's just difficult to understand to the lay people. So I don't think that's different. It might be a matter of degree. How difficult is this? There's actually more difficult things to buy, which are very complex systems, like a bridge. Buying a bridge is very difficult, especially if you do it through lots of different lots and you have to integrate stuff. That's also very complicated. Maybe not the technological, but the integration side of things. So I don't think that's fundamentally different. I think here, what I think is fundamentally different is the effect, right? So the problem is that once you deploy one of these things, the effects potentially are massive, especially if you look at the public sector, especially if you look at central government. And that's why I think we need to change the rule and to say you cannot deploy it unless we're really assured that this is going to be sort of okay, or we can incrementally do it. When procurement usually is not look at that. But even that's a similar problem. Say, food for the NHS. It used to be that every hospital bought their own food, then they started aggregating, and now there's a national framework for food. If the national framework for food falls for whatever reason, say a legal challenge, then there's no food in hospitals. So there's also mass effects. So even on that, I think we have a little bit of experience. But if you think about anything that is fundamentally different, we can chat about it. Correct.
Thanks, Albert. I mean, absolutely brilliant, really interesting, and brilliantly intelligible as well, because I was a bit nervous. I know nothing about procurement, and I know next to nothing about AI. Really sort of simple questions. I'm kind of thinking in terms of the UK perspective, and from like kind of regulatory diplomacy, right? And you're talking about the importance of having, why did they just have this voluntary standard? They wanted it to be mandatory. Who's doing the standard setting, right? So the national standard, is that BSI? And then if we're thinking internationally, is it ISO? Because they're really, really slow, right? And then, so, or is it really just 99% private standards and then a bit of public standard setting? Kind of what's the picture going on?
So I think ISO and IEEE, which is electrical engineering standard setting organization, have been working on this for a few years. So they are actually relatively developed. And there's going to be another big push, that is that when the EU AI Act gets in force, then they will have to develop standards under that. So then there's going to be also the UNE standards. But what I think is probably happening is that these organizations are mainly industry-based. So what's probably happening is that company A develops this project, say, this is how we do it. Everybody looks at it and says, like, sounds fine, let's make it the standard. There's lots of concern around that. But in terms of what is the British position, there's an algorithmic standards hub, and it's been populated with stuff from everywhere. So there's ISO, IEEE, and British standards. And I think what the government is trying to do is just give them transparency and see what happens. But yeah, but I think that's like the crucial regulatory turf in the next few years. And human rights groups and NGOs are already trying to lobby for the standard setting happening somewhere else, because these organizations are not inclusive.
Yes, sorry, me again. I was sort of follow up on what you were saying in terms of public and private cooperation at the sort of regulatory and sort of supervision level. And while you were talking, that reminded me of basically when you're thinking about values in terms of transparency and accountability, but then also what that leads to in terms of trust in the population into what's actually decided and then implemented. And one example for that, which is not AI-based, but of the last few years that we've seen, is the development of the COVID tracking app, I think, where you had in the UK, basically, government was hogging it, and then people were saying, nah, I'm not using that, it's just data grabbing. On the continent, in the EU, you had this basically cooperation of government development, Chaos Computer Club, test driving it, hacking it, trying to hack it, and then open source code, everything transparent, and that generated a lot more trust, and then people using it. So I think that could also then be sort of a way where we have top-level cooperation between public and private, where it's seen they're sort of supervising each other.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
No, that's a good observation, but on that, I'm a bit pessimistic, because with Kit and Andrew and Claire and Colin, we put together a response to the AI white paper, and one of the things that is very stunning in the AI white paper is it says, when people don't trust the technology, they don't use it. So if we want to increase the uptake of the technology, we need to generate public trust. That's kind of inverting the policy goal, which is you need to create trust, and then maybe people will use it, but you should not instrumentalize trust so that people use it. Maybe it's a bit nuanced, but I think that the UK's approach is we need to create the idea that this is trustworthy, otherwise we'll have a problem. I don't think there's a genuine commitment to having everybody represented and making something everyone can trust. And that worries me going forward, especially because when you're just bombarded all the time by high-level claims, it's very difficult to then go to the detail and say, actually, you shouldn't trust this because of this thing. You know, it's like the discussion now on encryption. I don't know if you're following it under the online harms bill. But basically, it's very clear that, and I think it's made the case, that if you make it possible for things to be unencrypted, then you're exposing it to hacking. So you need to have a frank conversation about, do we want fully secure systems, or do we want systems open to hacking? The government's discourse is like, well, we will not mandate the unencryption of things. So we want the power in the bill, but we will not use it. How is this creating a reasonable public discourse? And I think we have lots of issues around trust to deal with in the next few years, but that's a different story. Phil.
Hi, Albert. Another question from the I know nothing about AI and procurement crew. One thing that struck me listening to your presentation is, and again, it might be something that's worth looking at in how this goes forward, is there's a case going on at the CMA at the moment, a merger case with United Health, which is a massive American company, is buying EMIS, which has got about 40-50% of the market in GP technology and access to files. The interesting thing about the reference is the basis of the reference is the weirdest reference basis you will ever see, because they said they're worried about too much innovation. And they spent a lot of time talking to NHS Digital. And reading between the lines, it sounds to me like NHS Digital are worried that they don't have the capacity, the regulatory ability, or the mechanisms to control an enormous company getting access to GP and all of our health records, and innovating, which could well be AI-based models to extract data to build new products or new ways of using that data. So it sounds as though that case struck me as something that fits into some of your gaps. But I also wondered that given that there are lots of those gaps, and we have the CMA taking on responsibility for digital markets with, I think, probably around 200-300 staff, and it has responsibility for the single market and for procurement in a state aid sense, whether that's the location that it would be most efficient to go and talk to see how they could try and put some thought into how that might work.
Yep. No, that's a good observation. I think that the other very bizarre thing we identified in the AI white paper is that in the UK there are two regulators that are stronger than the others. One is the Competition and Markets Authority, the other one is the Information Commissioner's Officer. And a few years back, 3 years back I think, with the Financial Conduct Authority and the Medicines, and I think they got together and they created one thing called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. And they have been advancing these things and saying, how can we look at different things? How can we issue guidance? And what the AI white paper said is like, it's very nice that they're doing that, but there is a risk that they're overstepping the regulatory remit and that they will sort of overreach. So I think what lies a little bit behind all that is that the government wanting to keep control themselves of what the regulators are trying to do. So I think if the CMA got very active in procurement, all of a sudden that would ring a few bells. But yeah, I'll try to talk to someone there. I'll ask you for contacts. Any other questions or comments? John?
Albert, you diagnose the problems, the two problems, and you offer a solution. Is there any chance of a solution being realised? Are we just in deep trouble?
So is there any chance of the solution being realized? Not under this government, probably not under a next Labour government in the UK. I think this is so far from where we are at the moment that it's very difficult to get this implemented. So at some point I know that this is useless. You know, it's like I wrote all of this, maybe somebody will read it, nobody will do anything about it. But I think the point still needs to be made. And I also think this is not for this first wave of regulation. This is something that will keep happening. And at some point we will realize we're not getting things right in AI, we need to do something different. So maybe then is the thing, somebody will look at the garbage can, it's like, oh, there is Albert's book, let's do it. Maybe, I don't know. But I don't have high hopes of impact, if that's what you're asking me. Okay.
Further to that point, it just reminded me of that sort of austerity economic case for, you know, are we going to use algorithms just because we want to fire a whole load of people, or rather natural wastage, get rid of the civil servant blob that way, and replace it with a different blob. I'm reminded of a bit in Hood's Public Management for All Seasons, the one that really sets out new public management as, you know, we're still living in that really neoliberal type approach to administration. Do you think that the problem, that you were just saying, in that definitely not under the Tories, possibly not under a Labour government even, is that because we've bound ourselves to an economic framework that doesn't allow for redundancy?
I think there's part of that. I think the other thing is that there is an interesting New York Times opinion from this weekend by Morozov, and what he's saying is that the AGI-ism, so the trust that general artificial intelligence is going to sort out all of the problems, is going to create a plentiful society, is the natural next step from neoliberalism, right? And it says that the same reasons why we have gone so far down the neoliberal capitalist model, it's just fueling this, and that we need an absolutely different model, and it's a political choice that needs to be made. So I see your point. I think more pragmatically, what I don't understand is, you know, in terms of economic austerities, why is there 100 million to give out to entrepreneurs to develop the British ChatGPT, and there's not 100 million to pay for a regulator? It's the same 100 million. So it's just a choice of where you're putting your money, right? Maslov.
A very concrete question about training. So if one wants to be more optimistic about how this might end up, I think where I would be looking is at the levels of training and the increasing capacities and skills and knowledge in the public sector. And so you've presented some data regarding the recruitment of talent, but I'm wondering whether you look at the data as regards the upskilling of the existing talent. And where I'm coming from is when we look at the legal profession more generally, and I would presume that it would always be lawyers in the public sector who would get involved in the procurement regime. So when we look at the legal profession more generally, there is a very significantly increasing amount of budgets dedicated to upskilling with regards to digital technologies in particular. So is this something that you observe in the public sector? So
I think the short answer is no. I think that there is little money put into upskilling, but I'll give you a parallel example. So the procurement rules are changing, and the government has created a training program to upskill all of the commercial buyers to the new rules. We're talking about 7,000 to 8,000 people. And what they're going to do is one online module. If this is the way you want to upskill your task force, I can tell you whether it's going to work or not. And I think that's the problem, that it's such a mass enterprise that it would be very expensive, because you cannot just make people look videos and understand it. You need to provide different training. I think universities are missing an opportunity there to try to train, but also more generally, it's a very specific skill set. And you need to learn lots of stuff that lawyers tend to hate, like numbers and statistics and coding. So not everyone can be upskilled either. So I think there are challenges, but the most important thing is I don't think enough money is being put, and that there's not a viable program to deliver it, but it would be an obvious intervention. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've exhausted all questions. Thank you very much for a very interesting debate. And there's coffee probably cold and cake at the end, so let's enjoy that. Thank you.